First and foremost, welcome everybody, wherever you are throughout North Carolina and beyond. I hope you and your families and your loved ones are doing well during these strange and challenging times that we're in. I know that it's unusual to be online instead of in person, but I'm glad that we're still able to gather in this format. My name is Matt Hain. I think I know most of the folks I've seen on here, but if I haven't met you, my name is Matt Hain. I'm on staff with the North Carolina Study Center in Chapel Hill, which is a center for hospitality and Christian thought and Christian education at UNC, located right next to campus. We, like every other ministry right now, are moving online. So this is part of our ongoing ministry, is just to get to do events like this through an online platform. Still meeting with students and kind of keeping everything rolling, but just in an online format now. So we're very grateful that this worked out to have Brad and Margaret with us tonight. Tonight's webinar we're calling "Where is Your Treasure? Gauging the Economic Impact of Our Current Moment." And we're honored to have Dr. Brad Staats with us, who I'm going to give an introduction to in just a moment. But first, a couple matters of housekeeping. If you're just logging on, welcome. We can see who you are from our screens, but we can't see or hear any of you. So feel free to submit questions or engage through the chat screen. We're hoping there will be time for some audience Q&A towards the end. So just send your questions to us throughout this evening, and we'll do our best to get to some of those at the end of the evening. I also want to thank all of those who have helped to partner and promote for tonight. So thank you to Corey Whitaker, if you're on there, from Triangle Christian Medical and Dental Association, Hank Tarleton with InterVarsity Grad and Faculty. Also want to give a shout out and thank my 738 Bible study guys. So Rio, I see you on there. Thank you for helping consult on for some of my business students and econ students on the questions for tonight. Our fellow moderator, so I'll be one of the moderators tonight, and my fellow moderator is Margaret Marshall, who I've had the honor of kind of designing this event and working with this on. Margaret, as we said earlier, is coming to us from Signal Mountain, Tennessee, where she's from, and she is a sophomore at UNC, double majoring in economics and public policy, very involved at the Study Center and also with RUF campus ministry. I think Margaret has an RUF virtual meeting right after this tonight, so she'll be doing double duty. But yeah, Margaret's wonderful and perfect for this event, so we're really grateful, Margaret, to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, maybe to start off, just a quick bit, how are you doing? How are you processing all this? What's it like doing schoolwork from home?
I'm doing well. Definitely still figuring out the transition. Basically, most parts of my life in Chapel Hill, classes and organizations, like you mentioned, RUF is doing a virtual meeting tonight, and other organizations I'm involved with have been trying to keep up online. So kind of figuring out that transition. I'm definitely missing Chapel Hill a lot, but I'm glad that things like Zoom exist for us to stay connected. And I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation tonight. I think it'll be really interesting and helpful for fellow students like me, but also like my parents, I know, are very interested to hear what Dr. Staats has to say.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm counting on your econ and public policy background. That'll come in handy tonight, Margaret. Also, maybe update us on, as you've talked to friends, obviously everyone in the country is worried about the public health side of things right now, but specifically on tonight's topic of the economy. What's the talk been like with your friends and peers and classmates? Are college students thinking a lot about the economy right now? Where are y'all at in that?
Yeah, I think even for my friends who are like my age, who aren't going into the job market, like after this semester, we were all basically in the middle of kind of trying to figure out what our summers were going to look like, whether it was applying to internships or summer camp jobs or just regular jobs. And so I think that's been the biggest thing we've been talking about and trying to figure out is how is the economic impact going to affect what our summers are going to look like and how we're going to use our summers, because it's probably not going to be what we were expecting. And then for my friends who are older, just thinking about the job market and what this means for what life is going to be like post-graduation.
Yeah, that definitely rings true for all the, especially the juniors and the seniors that I've talked to. Awesome. Well, thanks, Margaret, for being with me tonight. Without further ado, let's introduce Dr. Brad Staats now. Brad is a proud University of Texas alum, so hook 'em horns. Yep, Brad also later completed both an MBA degree and a DBA degree at Harvard Business School, excuse me, and is now professor of operations and Sarah Graham Keenan Scholar at UNC's Keenan Flagler Business School. So we're on North Campus at the Battle House. Brad spends his time mostly on South Campus. He also is the faculty director of the Center for the Business of Health at UNC, which is an interdisciplinary center that brings together expertise from across UNC to create knowledge, prepare business leaders, and convene important conversations about the business of healthcare. In addition to that, another hat, he is an associate dean of the MBA program at UNC, and he recently, in a matter of only 5 days, oversaw the development of a course for MBA students in real time on business leadership in the midst of COVID-19, which is remarkable and makes him perfect. He's definitely the person that we want to talk to tonight. So Brad, welcome, and thank you for sharing your time with us tonight.
Of course, Matt, Margaret, happy to be with y'all.
Maybe to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about this course? How did you put together a course in 5 days, and kind of how is it structured, and what have some of the key takeaways been for you so far?
Sure. No, so I mean, it's I guess kind of ironic, the need for the course. So as you may know, we have an online MBA program at Keenan Flagler, the MBA at UNC program. And so that program is designed to primarily be online, except students basically twice, at least over the course of the program, do a 3-day weekend together. And so we kind of run those once a quarter, a couple in Chapel Hill, a couple others around the world. And so this one was going to be in Vancouver, and we were going to talk about sustainability and kind of a number of different aspects. When basically, as COVID-19 kind of steadily got worse, we realized that it was not a good idea to bring, what would have been 200 people basically primarily through Seattle, which was starting to feel the brunt of COVID-19. As part of that group of 200 students, we had about 40, call it, that was the final credit they needed for graduation. So necessity is the mother of invention. We realized we have these students that are about to graduate. They've got to get a credit. What can we do? And of course, studying COVID-19 seemed appropriate. So kind of wearing the hat of associate dean, I need to solve a problem with faculty director for the Center of Business of Health. Can we look at COVID-19? And so basically reached out to the faculty at Keenan Flagler, as well as kind of our advisory board. And we're able to pull together kind of some great folks, as we talked about, kind of an alum who was leading one of the largest kind of ED staffers for physicians. He's also an ED physician himself. Guy who's the number 2 at LabCorp doing testing to try to understand this. The financial implications, communications, operations, and I guess, kind of as you asked, lessons that came out of that, I think there were a few that stuck to me. Kind of the one was just around the uncertainty, right? So this was 3 weeks ago, which seems like an eternity right now, frankly. But even then, I recorded some video material on a Sunday, we launched it on Friday, and how much had changed there. And so I think there was an appreciation from the whole group of, we're in an incredibly uncertain time, and that's kind of disturbing, but it's also okay. And as business leaders, we need to be able to admit that, right? That as whether that's on the education front, whether that's you're running a company, as a student, it's okay to be confused right now because there's a lot of stuff happening that we don't understand. I think the other biggest piece that jumped out at me, and this will probably be a theme through my remarks, was kind of the comment by most speakers about the need for kindness in this sort of a difficult situation. That we are all impacted in different ways. I think for those of us who are in Chapel Hill right now, it's a little bit odd because if you're not in the medical complex, it's the calm before the storm. We're probably a month away is the current best guess. It could be longer from what the peak looks like. And so while everyone's sheltering in place, you don't feel it for most people yet. At the same time, the disruption, as we'll talk about, is massive. That we all are feeling it in some way, some far worse than others, not just medically, but economically. And so that need to really look out for other people. And I think it was exciting for me to hear that from so many people, regardless of kind of their background, saying, hey, we have to think about how we do right by students, right by employees, right by investors, right by you name it. And I think that's an important piece for us to consider.
That's great, Brad. So kind of moving towards a discussion of the economic big picture right now, how serious do you think the economic downturn that we're facing right now is? For example, one Federal Reserve estimate earlier this week projected a possible 32% unemployment rate. Do you think that that's realistic? And if so, how likely do you think it is?
That's a great question. So it is a major economic impact that we're seeing right now. When we often talk about kind of economic crises, we talk about either supply shocks or demand shocks, right? That there's something that's caused a disruption in the production of whatever materials we need, goods or services, or we tend to talk about it as a demand shock, that suddenly consumers ourselves don't have the money to spend that we once had before. Unfortunately, this is a rare supply and demand shock. So we're simultaneously seeing that negative impact on both, right? So, we kind of see the challenges of factories getting shut down due to COVID-19. And so, personal protective equipment isn't produced at the rate we need it. So we can't get that, that there are shortages of the materials we'd like to buy. At the same time, a lot of people have lost their jobs, as you were highlighting that estimate of, kind of 32% that we're looking at now. I think when you put all of this together, we should be taking it really seriously. I mean, the bulk of what I've seen are kind of 20 to 30% unemployment kind of ranges of where it's going to take us. I think in some ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, there's the short and the long-term effects of what we're looking at. So the language is sometimes used that the economy is being put in kind of a medically induced coma. Is I think a reasonably good, way to think about it, that because of our need to social distance, we're having to shut a bunch of stuff down. And so some companies and organizations are able to keep paying workers for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they can keep running their business. Others, even if they want to, are struggling with that, and that's leading to at least short-term unemployment. So, I think as we look at this, the stock market is not a perfect replica of the economy by any means, but we see that massive volatility. A lot of what that captures is the stock market trying to figure out what on earth is going on right now, right? If they knew perfectly what was happening, then that would get priced into the stock market. We'd see a big adjustment on day one, and it would just kind of sit there for a while. Instead, what we've seen is, each day or a couple of days, it is mostly swinging down massively, obviously, but, end of last week, it bounces up a couple, Monday was up, last 2 days it was down. And that's people, they're trying to predict the future kind of, right? What's the future going to look like for these, businesses that are listed on the stock market? So, short term, incredibly serious. Long term, we'll talk more about it, but, I think that's the question is, do we get on the other side of this and everything comes back, or do we see it actually kind of keep going for a little bit longer?
Yeah. So one thing I was wondering, Brad, I know Dr. Fauci, who's become a household name, he's talked about the epidemiological studies and the models. And one thing that he highlighted, I think in yesterday's press conference, was that, they're taking in a whole bunch of different data and modeling, a whole bunch of different models. But the ones that tend to make the headlines are like the worst case scenarios, just because they're the ones that attract the most attention. When we see numbers, like I think I saw something, Department of Labor said up to 50 million could be unemployed, or 32% unemployment. Is it kind of similar with economic modeling or forecasting? I know it's an inexact science, but when we see these headlines with these kind of like drastic numbers, do you think those are kind of well within the moderate bounds, or are those kind of some of the more extreme numbers that we're seeing?
It's a great question, and I get nervous trying to predict the future. But that being said, I think the principle is the same, right? The more extreme the view, the more likely it is to get press. And so we've seen that, on lots of dimensions. At the same time, I think then the question, whenever you see something, is, to beat on the assumptions, right? And so I think that's one of kind of the purposes of the center. The goal of the attendees here is how can we really be thoughtful? And I tell my MBA students a lot. My goal as an educator is to help you be kind of an informed student, right? To ask the right questions to try to make sense of things. And so what I'd say is 32%. Yeah, that's on the larger side. It's not absurd, right? That unfortunately, just look around, the U.S. right now in particular, and what we see is a number of our big employers, aren't operating, right? And so if you're restaurants, if you're retail, then your kind of cash flow has been curtailed really significantly. And so unless others step up to support them, and whether that's in the community still, doing pickup or takeout, whether that's the government, we'll talk about that later, really providing funds to keep people employed, then there's not going to be money for many. Some will have the ability to do it, but others won't. And so, I don't think it's a given we get to 30%, nor would I say, oh, that's, an impossibility as we look at things, unfortunately.
That's helpful. That's clarifying. I know it's very difficult to forecast, and it's obviously inexact. I like your analogy of the medically induced coma. I hadn't heard that before. But I guess one scenario would be, we maybe sometime late spring or early to midsummer, the economy awakes from that medically induced coma. And I know, the president has talked about it going off like a rocket ship, or the economy just kind of immediately, returning to kind of where it was. What are other scenarios? Like, are there other things that this could lead to bigger structural challenges right now? And if you had to, I know this is a really difficult question, but if you had to kind of look 1 to 3 years into the future, what are different likely scenarios you see for how the economy might shake out?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think, and I'm sure for a lot of the folks on this, they've been kind of watching that, there's been a question of when is this economic boom going to stop, right? That, we've been in kind of one of the longest bull markets, or the longest bull market in history since the kind of Great Recession of the 08-09 timeframe. And, up to, we started to see COVID-19 kind of catch more, common attention in January. But even in kind of October, November, December, people were wondering, hey, this can't go on forever. At some point, kind of the market will reset. At some point, the economy will probably take a step back. And so I think that's the undercurrent that gives me pause, at least, of will we really take off like a rocket? That, we have been booming. The standard macroeconomic model would say, hey, in bad times, the government needs to spend. In good times, the government then needs to tax at higher rates. We need interest rates to go up, and we kind of pay for all of that spending. If we look at kind of the current administration, they've done everything they can to keep the economy going, right? So we saw a big tax cut in good times, which is kind of the opposite of what one might have expected to see. We've seen efforts to keep interest rates low. And again, the benefit as interest rates go up, there's some short-term pain, but it gives you more, they sometimes refer to it as dry powder, more ability to respond to that negative downturn. Well, the Fed, for example, has responded by taking rates to zero, right? Real rates are now negative as we look at things. The government, deficit was already $1 trillion. Now we've just added a couple more trillion. And so, how far can you take that? I mean, the good news is we can take it a fair bit further. And we will need to do that as a country to keep things going. But I guess I think that while we certainly will see a rebound, or certainly is too strong, I think it's highly likely we see a rebound as we get through this, and we can talk more about kind of when maybe we get through this. But I'm not sure that we'll see it kind of take off the same way it was, because again, what's the lever to drive that? Unfortunately, interest rates are zero. The Fed really does have to take them back up eventually. And as they do that, there's, it's suboptimal from kind of cranking up the economy. So, it will be a positive change because there's been so much negativity over this month, really, here in the U.S. But I wouldn't say, oh, the stock market will be exactly what it was before. Oh, unemployment returns exactly to the place it was. in part because at least some of these negative impacts we're seeing right now, if you're a small business, it's not a guarantee you're going to be open 2 months later, 4 months later, 6 months later. You may just be out of business and not able to get a loan anymore to get going. And so then we see some disruption and people have to move around to different places.
That's helpful.
Yeah. So obviously, whether we're looking at the short term or the long term, a lot of the numbers and forecasts can be pretty scary, especially as a student. And as we talked about before, I'm currently a sophomore, but I have many friends who are juniors and seniors at UNC, including my older brother who graduated in December. So what is your word of advice to graduating seniors right now who don't already have a job lined up? And kind of similarly, what would you say to juniors or sophomores like me who are trying to pursue internships for this summer?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so the job market is something that kind of obviously I'm intensely interested in the associate dean role for the MBA program. So kind of constantly talking to our career and leadership folks, trying to understand kind of where things are at and how's it going. And, you know, we talk amongst our peers, and what I would say is, you know, if I look at that population that I know well, the good news is that so far we've seen very few full-time offers get pulled. We have seen interest still in hiring from certain companies. And so that, you know, depending on how long this runs, that may change. And I'll get to kind of the advice point, but first kind of the status check. Then on the internship front, we have seen some changes there, unfortunately. So some companies having to cancel their internship programs. We've seen far more kind of figure out how to do it virtually. And so still looking to bring folks on. And I think that's the good news is, you know, most organizations I've talked to, you know, view this as, you know, the big negative impact is a short-term blip. How long this actually lasts remains to be seen, but they know, well, that means we have to figure out how to operate virtually. You know, how can we actually make all this happen? Now we get to the advice point, you know, kind of what would my advice be? And I'll start with I guess it's the scary part. You know, what research says is folks who graduate into kind of a recession, not shockingly, they start earning less money, and over kind of the first chunk of their career, they also earn less money. And so that, you know, and that's largely driven by the lower starting salaries to begin with. You know, I think the advice I would give to, frankly, it would be the same I'd give to your graduating peers, that I'd give to your peers, that I'd give to somebody who was graduating 2 years from now, is, you know, in your first jobs, it's not about wealth maximization, it's about learning maximization. And so given what one knows about what they want to do now, not that, you know, I went into investment banking when I graduated from undergrad, and it was a fascinating job for a couple of years, but not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. But part of why I chose it was I'd been an engineer and I knew that I would learn a ton as I went through it. And so I think that same principle applies. You know, it could be, you know, that, you know, for that graduating senior, hey, maybe grad school is the right opportunity, that there are doors open now to go be an accountant, go be a lawyer, MBA program, you know, considers taking undergrads, whatever it might be, that kind of doors get opened in a way that they didn't plan on doing. You know, hey, I would take grad school in 4 years from now. Or again, from that first job standpoint, the signing bonus is nice. You know, how large your salary, if everything else is equal, is nice. But instead, it's, hey, given what you know right now, what do you want to do and how does that fit in? And so, I mean, I could spend the next 35 minutes talking about that. Kind of my research is around learning. And so I have a book called Never Stop Learning, Stay Relevant, Reinvent Yourself, and Thrive. And kind of the underlying premise is, hey, we're bad at learning, and there's a bunch of stuff that takes us in the wrong way. And so I think for everybody on this, where I would encourage folks is, you know, there will be opportunities out there. You know, it's incumbent on you then to work that much harder. They won't just fall in your lap the same way they might have, frankly, for the graduating class of 2019. But at the same time, that extra work you have to do is probably going to pay off in the long run, and, you know, set you up to do kind of learn what you can now, because frankly, salary maximization at 22 is, I don't have data to support this. I haven't seen data to go the other way either, to be clear. But anecdotally, if I look at kind of large sets of peer groups, that is in no way correlated with long-term life happiness or success. So, the fact that you can no longer get that job at blank, instead step back and what are the capabilities I either have or would like to develop, and think more creatively, right? Maybe you can go be that camp counselor. And before you were saying, darn it, I'm not going to do it because I can earn, $20,000 more. Well, maybe you can't anymore, but who cares? If that was the right job, go do it, play to that skill, and let it see where it takes you next.
That's awesome. Thank you, Brad. Maybe one more right now with the kind of macroeconomic big picture, and then we can transition. And this question actually comes from students who submitted this one. This is from Rio and Adam and Trent. Are there macroeconomic lessons that you think we can take away from this for the future? Or is there a likelihood that we will? And is there any way that we can kind of pandemic proof our economy? Or are there changes that we can make in case something like this were to happen again, where we could kind of structurally, shift parts of our economy to make this not as big of a challenge as it's been this time?
It's a great question. I mean, I'll start on the public health side. I mean, I think that one of the things I would hope everybody's doing is looking around the world and trying to pay attention to how different countries are responding. This is a kind of rare scenario where the same basic shock is hitting lots of countries at the same time, and yet we see massively different outcomes. And some of those outcomes are just differences in the population. Italy, has an older population, perhaps more smoking, some things like that make it harder. But a lot of it is in the response itself. And so I think that, one of the things that we see, with that public health response is that the U.S. Was slow to respond, was slow to ramp up testing. Once it started to do so, we haven't activated some of the things that we could have in terms of production, for PPE. And so I think what we will see in a good way is those early warning systems stood up to allow us to respond, right? If we look at, South Korea kind of being held up at the moment, at least as a good example, why? Well, they responded instantly. They put massive testing in place. They then put tracing in place to go with it, and then are able to get things going again. So I honestly think if we want to pandemic proof our economy, that's probably the number one thing that we can do. I do think on the second point, how do we make ourselves less sensitive? Well, there is an element that, good old Keynesian macroeconomics would have told us what to do before, which is, as things were going well, don't try to turn it up as much as massively possible, because we're going to make ourselves more brittle, right? And so if, instead, the government hadn't been giving tax cuts, but rather had been thinking about, well, maybe saving some money for a rainy day fund, or at least, frankly, we didn't need to have a rainy day fund as much as just reducing the deficit, increasing the Fed, increasing the Fed funds rate, would then give us more dry powder, so to speak, to respond to this. So I think those two pieces, actually following kind of macroeconomic principles and what they would have told us to do in good times, which is always hard, mind you, politically, but still a good idea macroeconomically. And then secondly, setting ourselves up to explore this. I mean, it's, as we can see, the fact that kind of a pandemic like this has hit us isn't a shock. It's been being talked about for a lot of years. In some ways, the surprise is that it's taken this long, right? That SARS never made its way, to the U.S. in any real form. That kind of some of the other ones that we saw them stopped.
That's helpful. That's helpful perspective.
So let's kind of transition and talk more about the $2.2 trillion stimulus bill that was just passed into law. So most of us only kind of have a layman's knowledge of what that entails. So can you help us gain a little bit of a deeper understanding of what sort of bill this is and what's the economic or business theory behind this specific bill's approach to stimulating the economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I'm certainly happy to offer some thoughts. I've spent some time looking at it, talking to people far smarter than me to kind of try to understand it. And it's doing a bunch of different things. I'll start by saying, it's talked about as a stimulus bill. I frankly think, and others have said this too, that it's better to look at it a little bit more as a disaster relief bill. So if we think about kind of stimulus, this is often kind of a story of, hey, we need more demand in the economy, so let's put $1,000 into a consumer's hands. They rush out, they spend $1,000, and then that works its way through the economy and has some real benefits. The challenge that we face right now is that people don't have enough money as they lose their jobs, as unemployment spikes. And so, it's the equivalent of, think about how if you go in when Houston had all of its flooding, how you go help support Houston. You're not trying to stimulate the economy, you're trying to help them rebuild it, right? Or when hurricanes hit, you're trying to rebuild. And that's largely what I would say this bill is about. And so if we look at it, there's probably, we can think of kind of 5 buckets that money has gone into as part of it. And so, rough estimates, but, roughly $500 million, a little bit more, going in to support individuals. And so that, is largely about how do we put money into people's hands so they can get what they need. Money talked about, the checks that will eventually be cut to folks. Now, those will be means tested. So kind of if you're above a certain income, kind of you won't see it. But that's, again, pushing people's money back into their hands. A huge part of that is unemployment insurance. And so that's changing how long you can get unemployment insurance, kind of how big the benefit is. But again, the challenge there, and we'll get to this later, is, that's not suddenly making people wealthy when they weren't before, right? It's replacing income is the really big deal there. Now, that one bucket is on the individuals. The next big bucket is, the next 2 buckets really are business. And there's kind of funds for big business and there are funds for small business. These are written to do a bunch of different things, but fundamentally you can think about it as, how do we keep these businesses open and functioning? So some of it is just things like working capital. Again, one of the easy ones is we can think about the airlines. So the airlines have bills to pay, people aren't flying anymore, they're not getting cash. Unfortunately, and this is back to your earlier comment, a lot of businesses, tried to get leaner and leaner in terms of things like working capital, about the amount of cash they kept at hand, because it was so cheap to borrow money. Why would I need to keep cash? Well, if suddenly, I'm losing hand over fist, that cash would be really helpful to actually pay the bills, but they don't necessarily have it. So both the small and the big, some of it is loans to keep people going. Some of it is money, either grants or forgivable loans, that if the companies basically don't lay employees off. If you'll keep your payroll, then the government will give you some money. And again, think of that as a way to pass money on to individuals. So instead of somebody losing their job, they still have the money to pay their bills. That's good for 2 reasons. 1, the person can pay their bills, and 2, it makes it more likely when we bounce back that company can just turn things back on, as opposed to having gone bankrupt, they're shuttered, and they can't get going again. Another big chunk of money is money going to the state and local governments. So, we guess most people appreciate, a big difference between the federal government and our local or state governments is the federal government can run a deficit. The federal government can spend more money than it makes. And again, from an economic standpoint, that's a good idea, in that, they can kind of help deal with the booms and the busts. The state government, here in North Carolina, for example, needs to balance their budget. And so the struggle then is when things are going really poorly, the state government can't say, hey, I'll borrow on the future. The state government can only spend what it has. Now, there is a rainy day fund. Most states have tried to do this. In good times, save some cash that we can spend now. But when suddenly you have COVID-19 expenses that you hadn't budgeted, kind of the state economics would say you actually have to cut something. So what are you going to cut? Are you going to cut food stamps? Are you going to cut education? Are you going to cut roads? You don't have a lot of choices. And so the federal government is sending money to the state and local governments. That's around $300 billion or so. The last piece, so the fifth pillar is the public health side. One of the challenges for just take hospitals is they've had their expenses go up massively. They're covering these COVID-19 patients, often spending a lot more money than they will kind of get paid back from an insurance company or from the government, Medicare or Medicaid. Also, it's estimated about 75% of the profits for a standard hospital come from their elective procedures. So this might be a knee replacement, cardiac catheterization, and elective procedures, things that are not kind of urgent, have been canceled to free up capacity in the hospitals and also to protect folks to not get sickness. And so the struggle is those hospitals now suddenly have a massive gap, and there's a bunch of other things that are driving it too. And so the government has stepped in to try to provide some money there. So, I think the good news when we look at the $2 trillion is it's being spent. Well, it has the potential to be spent wisely as it goes to individuals to support them, as it goes to big and small companies to allow them to stay open in order to not kind of result in profits, but to pass on to keep people on the payroll, as it helps state governments, cover their obligations, and as it helps the public health system stay open. I think the concerning thing for most folks is, given how long we think this is going to last, that $2 trillion is not going to be enough by itself. And so we're going to see more money need to get spent by the federal government.
That's helpful, Brad. We actually had a question submitted from one of our viewers, John Onderdonk, about why companies weren't carrying more cash on hand. So I think you answered that as part of yours, so thank you.
Sure thing.
Maybe, Margaret, do you want to transition to a culture of work for us?
Yeah, so kind of looking at not just how this is going to affect the job market, unemployment, things like that, but for those of us who are working, do you think that this is going to accelerate the trend towards remote work? Or do you think it'll lead us to see the value of in-person work and have the opposite effect? And kind of similar, WeWork was kind of in the news recently for struggling prior to the pandemic. So do you think that co-working spaces like that will see a rise in interest or a decline in interest?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, I guess inertial tendencies, so like the status quo is really strong. It's really hard to get people to change what they're doing, whether that's virtual work, whether that's kind of using technology as tools, not traveling, but doing things through Zoom. Again, if we look at education and we think about the role of using technology for education. So back in 2011, Keenan Flagler launched its online MBA program. And when we did, we were the first top 20 to do this. A bunch of folks looked at us kind of funny saying, hey, this makes no sense. Our dean at the time, Jim Dean, our dean now, Doug Shackelford, was running that program. And they kind of believed, hey, we can put these things together. So for a certain audience, we don't have to make compromises. We can give them an amazing educational experience. And they thankfully had the vision to do it, and it's been a big success. That is a long way to say, I think there will be silver linings in this massive disruption. I don't think it's suddenly going to be the University of North Carolina will offer all of its classes online and only online. That would be silly. There's a lot of stuff that we should do in person and that's better in person. At the same time, can anyone say zero education should be done online using whether it's asynchronous technology, kind of well-produced videos, or sometimes using distance learning? I think we will look back and appreciate that was equally absurd for folks to say, that, there is blending that should be done in education. There's blending that should be done in the workspace. Why shouldn't we be flexible enough for people to work from home sometimes? Should it be 100%? No, not for most jobs. Should it be more than zero? Probably based on what people need. And I think that's what we've seen in a lot of really creative companies. A lot of my time in the last decade has been spent kind of on that. How do I understand learning? How do I understand companies that are really innovative? And a lot of that is them saying, hey, we need to give people freedom, right? These tight restrictions of kind of micromanaging people, they might say, maybe it makes sense if I'm actually just trying to control your hands and I'm trying to make sure you do this motion, 1,000 times a day. But, if I'm actually trying to engage your head, and if I believe your heart might at all be a part of what's going on here and helping you be more successful, I need to be flexible. And so I think that's what we're going to see in lots and lots of industries. We see it even in healthcare. There's all these concerns right now about, do we have enough capacity to deliver what we need? Well, thanks to regulatory changes, thanks to creativity, there's much more telehealth being used, so you can visit your doctor virtually. Are there things I need to see my doctor in person for? Absolutely. Are there other things to get a prescription refill that I should be able to do by email or a quick video? Absolutely too, right? We see virtual intensive care units being set up. We see doctors being called in for consults. So I do think that this change will be useful. And so kind of the absurdity of whenever we need to get together, we need to get on an airplane, fly halfway across the country and chew up, 1 to 2 days for an hour and a half together. Occasionally, yes, it is so important. I need to be next to you. It's not that that's zero, but again, there's a balance in there. And so I think that's the exciting piece to me of, hey, we've taken some of the kind of restrictions and allowed us to kind of shake things up. How might we put them together in a productive way?
It's gonna be fascinating to see, like sociologically, kind of the patterns of work, and when we look back on this, hopefully 3 to 5 years down the road, and kind of take stock of what happened, just the ways that it changes culture and the culture of work. I've got one, Brad. This one's from a student. It's kind of a two-part question, it looks like. But their question is, how would you, and I'm sure this varies a good bit, but how would you assess the impact on this in terms of the existential threat or the threat that it poses to small businesses versus like larger corporations? Like how are kind of both impacted, and which one's taking the heavier brunt of this, I guess you could say? And then they specifically asked, do you think that this is likely to accelerate the movement towards e-commerce among small businesses?
Let's see. So let's start with kind of the first question is I think the threat is much bigger on small businesses. That, if we just look at, you could look at the American economy for however long you want, and we generally see this rise of steadily bigger businesses. And it's only been accelerated over the last, 20 years or so, longer, I suppose, with Walmart and Amazon. Retail is a good way for us to look at this, right? And so Amazon kind of slowly taking over more and more things. Yes, small businesses can go through Amazon's platform, and so they can reach a market. And if you're very small, that's great. But if you start to get too big, you're kind of, there's a ceiling above you in many cases, not all, that, Amazon's taking a big enough chunk of your profits. Maybe kind of they copy what you're doing. And so it's tough to get even bigger than that. I think the challenge that this is going to create, and we saw a little bit of this in 08, 09, of kind of a too big to fail mantra, that if you're enormous, your ability to lobby the federal government, your ability to make it clear why it is so painful that losing these 10,000 jobs, and so getting somebody's attention is more likely to happen. When you're kind of talking about 5 jobs, it's really hard, right? That it takes a bunch of those companies to kind of add up to the same thing. And so my biggest fear, and again, the $2 trillion helped. It was a step in the right direction. I think there was early versions of that bill that didn't give nearly as much attention to the small businesses. But I think there is a rightful fear that these companies burn through their life savings with an owner who's trying to do right by people, trying to keep it going. They don't get enough support. They go out of business, and they're not able to start back up again. So I think that if for small businesses, will this kind of accelerate things like e-commerce? Yes, but most of them were already doing that, frankly. And so the challenge that's sat above them of how do they grow, how do they support themselves still existed. But one of the things I'd encourage the group is to think about the small businesses you work with, whether that's kind of a service provider. If we see this happening for folks who provide cleaning services, folks who do restaurants, folks who cut hair and things like that. How can you still provide some support to them? As you can see, like my hair is really shaggy. Reaching out to kind of woman who cuts my hair and be like, hey, can I pay you this month even though I'm not getting a haircut, right? Do you need that? And to the extent folks can do that, I think we're called to do that, frankly.
As we kind of talk about the economic impact, something that's at least been on my mind a lot recently has been kind of holding both the economic impact of this and the public health impact at the same time. And it does seem like public health officials are pretty united in saying that it's crucial for American citizens to stay home, to be socially distancing, and some states have even introduced stay-at-home orders. But as someone in the business sector, I'm sure you have a pretty strong sense of the economic toll, as we've been discussing, that's kind of involved in the decision to stay home and not be a patron, whether it's at a small business or a big business. So what is your perspective on how we should balance the priorities of doing the best we can to revive the economy with the imminent public health concerns that we're facing?
I think it is a fascinating theoretical discussion, and one that we probably could spend several hours getting into the moral and ethical side of things. I think that COVID-19, to be blunt, is a rather easy decision. And as I look at kind of the economist, most kind of well-trained economists that I've seen, and I kind of share the same assumptions, are the economic impact of keeping things open is going to be massively negative. That, the problem, and we can look at somewhere like Italy as a good example of this, we are dealing with a disease that either no one or almost no one seems to have kind of pure immunity to, or at least a very small percentage, that, because the bulk of society, we don't have the exact number, but the bulk of society has not had this before. And at the moment we have no treatment for it. And it is deadly. How deadly, we could get into a long debate of what's the case fatality rate and all of that, but it's deadly enough that if we do nothing to stop it, then we flood our healthcare system, we massively overwhelm it, we're not able to take care of the people with the basics of things like ventilators, and then any other problems that exist flow through, and we would see the death rate skyrocket in the US. And so, I think that, that economic discussion is obviously something that if you're kind of a health economist, if you're, an actuarial scientist, you have to be able to look at that and do those trade-offs. But right now it is, if North Carolina were wide open right now, then we would see eventually the disease spread and it overwhelm, and not only have a horrifying loss of life, but a kind of horrifying economic impact. So I guess, I don't know if good news is quite the right way to describe it, but the easy decision, at least in my view, is to lock stuff down, with then very clearly the federal government's responsibility to step in and backfill the situation so that people are taken care of. The thing we need to recognize is, we will eventually get through this, whether it's this summer, whether it's this fall, whether it's longer, and then there will be rebuilding to be done, right? So thinking, oh, I'll give a tax cut, when all of this is done, no, we're actually going to have to swing it the other way. It is fine to be borrowing money in a negative interest rate environment. And so we don't need to be terrified of that, but we also can't say, well, we never have to worry about it. We will later. And so many of the folks on this call will have to lean into that.
That's really interesting to see, because I've heard that tension too, Margaret, that you tapped into. So I appreciate your perspective, Brad, that these are actually aligned, like the economics of it and the public health concern and the morality are all kind of aligned with one another on it. I think we've incorporated a good number of audience questions. I've looked at the list here kind of throughout our conversation. We've got about 10 minutes max left, Brad. So I'd like to make sure we have time for kind of the faith tie into this too that we've been discussing this week. You are not only an educator and a Keenan-Flagler business professor, you're also a Christian. And I'm wondering if you'd share a little bit with us about how your faith maybe impacts your perspective on this, or what have you kind of been drawing from your faith in this time as we've been going through this kind of national really difficult season?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess I'd probably answer it on multiple levels. I mean, one is crises make it easier to turn, at least for me, perhaps sadly, but turn to God in prayer. It is a disturbing time. It is an uncertain time. We need a rock to fall back on. Yeah. And so, taking that pause and knowing that God is there, that we will be taken care of, even if we don't know what that means right now, I think is a really big deal. And it helps kind of bring the stress level down to then start to think, right? Okay, now what are the right choices? How can I move forward? And I think that's one of the pieces. I think another piece that has always, I guess, sat underneath kind of my belief of leadership, my belief of running an organization, my research, frankly, as well, is that, kind of dehumanizing people can't possibly be the way that we're intended to do things. And so, there are times that might appear to be a good way to run something, but I have always had an incredibly hard time believing that could plausibly be the right answer in the long run. And I think that the good news is that it's not, right? And so, faith helps us get there, but we can also do careful research and study to see, wow, treating people well, seeing who they are as a person, respecting them, helps them perform at higher levels. And it helps us perform at higher levels. And so I think that's a really big deal to remind ourselves in this crisis, which flows into the third one of how can we help others, right? And so I think it's it's a lot weird that we see a crisis and it, traditionally that brings the community together, right? We want to kind of gather and help one another with hugs and supporting and kind of a very explicit manner. And now we're being told to social distance. And so I think that then makes it incumbent on us as Christians to think very carefully how and who needs support. What is it that I should be doing? And a lot of that is going to be economics, right? I've been blessed with much. So how do I make sure that the public schools are being supported with all the extra meals they're now needing to feed kids? How do I support, my church and what they're doing, others who are out in the community? But I think that third pillar is a huge deal. We see a lot of folks finding creative ways to do it. I see Becca's on kind of a neat kind of fundraiser that she did with MBAs to kind of bring bagels from one of our MBA founders to UNC Health's emergency rooms to help support kind of our frontline caregivers. And that's probably been a last point of, not only praying to calm ourselves, but praying for protection and, kind of for grace for the heroes on the front lines that are out there, doing amazing work. Kind of in our hospitals, in our doctor's office, and in other public health settings.
So kind of on a similar vein, this is actually a question submitted by my brother, so thank you, Marker. Aside from tithing, giving money to charities, do you have any specific recommendations of specifically economic decisions that Christians could make to honor God with their finances during this crisis?
That's a great question. So yes to everything he said. Good answers. As we look at it, I think it's kind of tied into his second one, and I sort of referenced this earlier. Finding ways to spend the way one might have before. I think for many of us, myself included, our first instinct when things go south is kind of how do I gather near me and hold kind of my treasure close. As protection, when instead, not saying, that we are necessarily called to go do, kind of max your credit card out or something, but instead, how can I find ways to maintain kind of what I was doing before? How can I reach out to check on people? That, I think one of the things the three of us talked about, are kind of, who's out there that's most at risk, right? And being mindful. Okay, well, some of that's socioeconomic status. Folks who kind of were earning less, who had less cushion, now are in a bad place. And that may be fellow classmates, that may be others elsewhere, who've lost their jobs. And so what small things might you do, perhaps even without anybody knowing, right, that you could pick up for somebody and leave for them? I think alongside of that, there's an economic piece. There's also this is a time of really difficult mental health. And so I tie into, who can you reach out to and check up on? Maybe you're not so good at calling your parents or your grandparents or somebody else in your life. How do you just ping them and let them know you're there? How do you write a note to somebody and send it to them, or take a picture of it and text it to them, or whatever that might be? But I think that this is sort of back to your innovation question from earlier. We're seeing great action on the personal connection front, even though it's not physical connection. Tying that in and realizing a lot of times the support people need is to know somebody's thinking about them right now, and that sort of you've got their back.
That's awesome, Brad. Great practical steps there that we can take. One quick anecdote, if that's okay. A student who I kind of meet with and disciple and do Bible study with had reached out to me last week or 2 weeks ago, and asked me if I would serve as a reference for him, and said, expect a call this week. And I kind of said, man, I'd be honored to, but is anyone hiring right now? Everything's kind of shutting down, And he said, well, it's actually for the food pantry in town. And he was, trying to, led by his faith, trying to sign up for a way to socially distance, but also be able to help transport food to those in need. So I love your practical tie-ins just with the way we can kind of be the hands and the feet, even in this strange time of social distancing. I think we're almost up at 8 o'clock right now. So unfortunately, we probably got to wrap up here. Brad, this has been phenomenal. As somebody who's a humanities background and not a business or economics background, this has been very enlightening for me, and hopefully for everyone else on our call tonight. Thank you, Brad, very much for being with us. Thank you, everyone who took time to log in tonight. Hope you enjoyed this. Just as a closing thought, Brad, you talked about the rock earlier, and I think that's been the biggest reminder for me about this, is that the market is not certain. The market is going to, can go all kinds of up and downs, but our foundation in Christ, the rock that our faith is built upon, is firm. That foundation is solid, and you have a unique gift and skill set to be able to bring both the economics and business side of this, but also the faith side. So thank you for bringing those two together for us tonight and sharing. I think that's all we have. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here. And if y'all are okay with it, usually we like to wrap up with prayer. Would that be all right with you, Brad, if we do that? And maybe
that'd be great. Absolutely.
Margaret, would you be willing to pray for us to close out tonight?
Of course. Dear God, thank you so much just for the gift of little things like Zoom to help us connect with one another, and be able to discuss the uncertainty that we're facing right now. I thank you for Brad and his wisdom and knowledge, both in the economic sphere, but also the way that he's guided by you. And yeah, I just thank you for the Study Center, the resources that they provide, and specifically Matt's guidance in planning this event, and thinking about the questions that students, parents, and kind of everyone in our community is asking. I pray that you would help us take some of these things to heart, especially as we look for how we can reach out to those struggling around us due to this outbreak. And I pray that you would just give us a sense of peace in a time of uncertainty, whether we're unsure about the job market, what this is going to mean for whatever economic investments we might have, just as we look forward. Help to remind us that our treasure is not in money or jobs or status, but that it is in you, and we have a greater hope for the new world that you'll be bringing. And in your name we pray. Amen.
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 Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Brad.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thanks, Margaret.
Everyone be safe,
God
be
bless you.
well. And also, quick announcement, we'll be coming back next Wednesday, with one on moral and ethical questions that we're facing right now. Dr. Farr Curlin, who runs the Theology, Medicine, and Culture program at Duke, and is an ethicist and a physician, will be with us. And so we'll have more details coming out to everyone about that, but stay tuned for next Wednesday for another webinar for those who'd like to tune in. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.